Diana, so good to see you. I must start off by saying it's so good for me to be home, even though I was gone for 5.5 weeks. I was up in your neck of the woods in North Carolina and Virginia and got to go in to see the Death Star in DC for a day.
Right.
And you could feel kind of the evilness of it. Like it was cool though.
Yeah,
I got to walk by the Treasury Department and the Commerce Department, all these things that I've talked about that I
right.
went there when I was a little kid, but to see it again with your own eyes and have a different perspective, see Kennedy's eternal flame and in Arlington Cemetery, but it's good to be back home just to have my access to my studio again, and not be and just record whenever I want to record. So there's nothing like
Right.
being back home, even though
No place like home.
no, even though it's going to be 116 or 117 in Arizona this week. So
Yikes. Yeah.
yeah, I don't know why people live here. I don't know why I live here, Diana.
Well, now you've seen there's other places in the country, so
Yeah, and it's it's the grass and the green and the trees and it just I mean, you've been all over the place. I mean, there's nothing. I don't know. Maybe it's because the first time I saw it that I really
yeah,
loved it. But
yeah,
there's,
yeah. Well, it does have its appeal. It's more peaceful, I think, when there's green. But
and I like the idea of it raining because we just don't get a lot of rain where I live. Like the idea
yeah,
of rainfall and water is very appealing to me.
yeah, yeah.
So we would have done this conversation sooner, but I thought, well, let me. It makes more sense for me when I get back that we can sit down and talk. And I always enjoy chatting with you anyway, and I appreciate you thinking of me in regards to this conversation. So I'm going to turn it over to you, and let you discuss what we were exchanging in our DMs and what you wanted to talk
Okay.
about today. This episode is brought to you by McIlvaney Financial Group. Their advisors bring a depth of knowledge and experience that allow them to serve their clientele with care, ensuring their financial needs are met now and in the future. Personally, I'm not saying cash is worthless, but you can see what's happening. It's worth less every year. Gold is the opposite. Click on the promo link in the show notes or go to www.mcilvaney.com/coffeeandamike.
Yeah, sure. Well, I like talking to you. You're very open, and I wanted to get out into the conversation again. Some big picture items that have been essentially erased, and they have to do with Islam and the impact of Islam on the non-Islamic world. This is something I was explaining to you because it's everything is a long story these days. When you've been writing as long as I have, it's always a long story because I've been at it for a long time. But the anniversary of 9/11, 25th, is coming up next year. So this is a long time coming, this conversation really. But after 9/11, I was an editorial writer at the Washington Times, and I wrote a weekly column that had been going out over a wire service, Scripps Howard. But the week of 9/11, it just so happened that my weekly column, went into syndication. So it's always been kind of a marker that of time, and this column and this entire subject also came together for me at that incredibly historic moment. And as a, I'm not, I, at the time, especially, I was mainly interested in culture and politics. I wasn't really a foreign affairs columnist too much, and I didn't really do any military commentary or anything even approaching that. Of course, we were not in a war at that moment, but I had kind of a baptism by fire, if you will, in an education on Islam because at the time of 9/11, very few people knew anything about it. And as I was struggling to learn, I was immediately coming up against obstacles and censorship and ostracism and you name it. And I was very conscious of what language could be used, what the freight would bear in the public square, because I was writing newspaper columnists, I was writing editorials at the Washington Times. I forget if I mentioned the paper, and also going out over the wire. So I was very acutely aware of what could be said, what should be said, what wasn't being said, etc. So along about a few months into all of this, this, terrible frenzy that happened at that time after the destruction of the Twin Towers and the Pentagon and the plane in Pennsylvania and all of the talk, we were immediately told that Islam was the religion of peace by President Bush. I believe it was on September 12th. And one of the next things that happened was in terms of his efforts to find the terrorists who did this, we were told by President Bush that this crusade against this evil would take a while. And then, now this is a very important moment, we had that comment withdrawn by his press secretary, Ari Fleischer, at the time, because it offended Muslims. The use of the word crusade offended the Muslim community, etc. This is something I go through at great pains in my first book, The Death of the Grown-Up. So these are sort of some of the points at the very beginning that caused me to delve into this effect that Islam had immediately on freedom of speech. And this becomes a very complicated study that goes into really the 1400 centuries of Islam, because this is an aspect or weapon of the jihad to turn the world Islamic. And what I learned along the way is kind of what I wanted to share with you today, because if you notice in this since the middle of, or maybe even early June, for the past 5-6 weeks, especially, we've had this very intense discussion about Israel and Iran and the United States and bombing the nuclear site and so on. And of course, Gaza, and all of these things have been roiling in our consciousness and our reading and watching, and in reality in the Middle East. But if you think about it, we have not been talking about any of these things in terms of Islamic jihad or the life of the dhimmi being Jews and Christians who are subject to Islamic law, or Dimitude, which is non-Muslims, Jews, Christians, others, who are subject to Islamic law without necessarily knowing it. And this would get back to the speech codes. So this is sort of a long way of introducing the subject. But the silence on Islam protects Islam, and also indicates that we are not having this grown-up discussion, which takes me back to The Death of the Grown-Up, because this was sort of my look at how our culture had become very infantile over a period of decades, let us say. And here we were after 9/11, because it's a post 9/11 book. Here we are after 9/11, and it is almost as if we have been created for this moment in terms of being unable to stand up as fully sovereign citizens and have a grown-up discussion about Islam. And that is sort of a cartoonish way of discussing a very serious subject, but unfortunately, it really fits. So where we are now is back when I was, say, that first decade after 9/11, what the fight was about this difference between so-called moderate Islam and extremists. So there was this idea that was propaganda that the violence and the terrorism was un-Islamic. So we were constantly fighting over, did moderate Islam exist? What was it? Well, unfortunately, it doesn't exist in any of the canonical mainstream texts of Islam. So it was always agitation propaganda, the whole debate. But now we're at a point where it isn't even in the discussion any longer. And so we watch the Islamization of Europe and don't talk about Islam. We watch the struggle of Israel against its Islamic neighbors. We don't talk about Islam. And we have this, now we have this presidency that is in some ways surrounded by a number of Islamic assets, you could call them, that are also having a big effect on our policymaking of President Trump. And we're not talking about Islam. So I thought it was a good idea to come on your show and try to hash some of this out, because it's very difficult when there is no context to approach these topics. And that is what has been erased on my watch, you might say, but I've been doing my best. But in this quarter century, almost since 9/11, this is what has been erased, even as the world has turned heavily Islamic, and the impact of Islamic law, which is called Sharia, has been just seismic and continues to be. So that's kind of what I wanted to discuss. Does that make sense as I've presented it? Because it's a lot of information.
Yeah. So first question that pops into my head, and I'm curious, as long as you've been doing your work, what was the censorship like back during that time period where you had to be, and correct me here, you had to be very careful in your word selection? Is that because certain words were not able to be spoken or written at that time?
Well, I was fortunate. I was not. I was lucky. I was able to write my column as I wished it for the Washington Times, for the Syndicate, and it would be up to individual newspapers if they wanted to run it. I don't think I had personally. I had a pretty good um, relationship with truth seeking, and I was able to pursue it. I would say, as a rule, I did not personally have the censorship, but I watched others. I watched other columnists get smacked down. I can think very early on of Ann Coulter and Mona Charen, both being sharply chastised after 9/11 for different columns that they had written questioning. I think Mona Charen was questioning Islamic exchange students in the United States at that time. Ann Coulter had some, I think she lost her column at National Review over, one of her colorful discussions of Islam back in the day. I don't think she really covered it much in the subsequent time. A lot of people, I mean, this is sort of the cycle that we see, whether it's governmental, media, cultural, is there is the fear of a crazy terrorist that translates to a suppression of anything that might trigger that possibly lone or small group of terrorists. But the fear goes through the society, the suppression goes through the society. And what you really see quickly, and this would be more about answering your question, you see self-censorship. And I would just draw your attention back to the very famous series of jihads waged against the tiny Danish newspaper, Jyllands-Posten, that started at about 2005. If you remember, they printed a broadsheet of cartoons, illustrations that they commissioned of Muhammad. And they were all kinds of, they were political, they were jokes, it was just, a newspaper exercise that Jyllands-Posten initiated because they did not want to be they wanted to show that Denmark was not under Islamic law. Under Islamic law, you're not allowed to draw Muhammad, any imagery of Muhammad. You're certainly not allowed to question him, criticize. In the tradition of the West, in which we draw, we criticize, we caricature everything. So they, as Danes, proud Danes, wanted to prove to the world, oh, well, our newspaper, we can still do whatever we want. We're not under Islamic law, despite already 20 years ago, an Islamic population in Denmark. And if you remember, do you remember this series of events? Were you too young at the time? But
No, I remember it, but it also reminds me of South Park. Remember the creators of South Park did something
yes,
similar, and they came on, and
similar.
that might have been right around that same time period.
It extended for a long time, and there was a terror cell that tried to attack the newspaper. One of the main cartoonists, Kurt Westergaard, who drew the most famous image of Muhammad with a turban shaped like a bomb that was going to go off. So made him this cartoon made him a target of assassins, including one that even got into his house one New Year's Eve. This went on this went on at the ambassadorial, state to state level. There were boycotts of Danish goods. There were riots around the Islamic world. People were killed in these anti-Muhammad cartoon riots. This was a very, very big deal that I think really I can just encapsulate it by when Yale University Press published a scholarly work about this multi-year free speech case that showed, I mean, it really was a fascinating, if horrifying case. And I wrote endlessly about it myself. But they published an academic treatment of the book. And lo and behold, guess what they didn't put in the book? the cartoons, out of sensibility, out of deference, out of fear. And again, this is a demonstration of this concept of Dimitude. Obviously, we have the First Amendment, obviously Yale University Press and many, many others, including the newspapers of America, who would not even put a cartoon in the paper to show people what the riots were about. We have, not me, but we have all absorbed as a society, we absorbed this law of Sharia against criticizing Islam. And I think it's a very important lesson that people must be acquainted with, because it is not a one-off. This is society-wide, and it continues to hobble, if not cripple, our attitudes, our responses, our understandings of how the world is changing through Islamic immigration, through Islamic law, etc. So this is, again, what it continues to be missing, much worse than, back in the day when the argument really was certainly one-sided and certainly very difficult to get anything through. But now nobody's even asking these questions or wondering about it. It has been Islam has been successfully eliminated, even from a conversation about the Islamic Republic of Iran, which is an Islamic republic, doesn't even have the patina of being any kind of a more modern, Arab state, Muslim state. And I don't know if you know this, but I just wanted to read, if I wrote it down here, that in the Constitution of Iran, it says it is the country's mission to expand sovereignty by destroying the infidels for the glory of Allah. So in other words, the Constitution puts Iran in a constant state of war against the non-Islamic world. And this is obviously of import when one is trying to understand, trying to deal with, trying to react to, but it's gone. It's utterly gone from the conversation. And that was, why I thought, well, it'd be nice to kind of toss it around with Mike and see about reintroducing this extremely, obviously, central core aspect of the struggle, of the war, of the diplomacy, of the commentary, everything else. And it's like, I don't know, it's like talking about nighttime without talking about stars or the moon or something. I mean, it's so integral to what is going on. And yet we have been so dimmified that we pretend that it isn't even there.
See, when I hear that, I mean, I think to myself of the people that I personally know that are from Iran, here in Phoenix, and again, this is just whatever this is worth, but they are not a fan of their government. They are from there. There's a reason why they left there.
Sure.
But and some of them are Muslim, some of them are not anymore. They're Americanized now. But they're good people, right? And I'm not saying you're saying that, but I mean, just in terms of like what I think about. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, the anecdotal and the personal is not how we do statecraft. However, I think the wise answer to that is from a writer, an ex-Muslim named Ibn Warraq, whose book it was happenstance on 9/11, or I guess it was probably 9/11 or 9/12. I went to my local bookstore. We still had bookstores all the way back then. And
seems like there are more of them now, though, isn't there, Diana? Isn't there a resurgence of bookstores? Even though
I hope so.
They're
I haven't
so
noticed.
woke. They're so woke and they're so left leaning that they're.
Yeah. Well, this was a not Barnes and Noble. What was that other one? The chain. It went away. Got eaten up by Barnes and Noble.
Walden Books.
No, it was Chapters. No. Anyway, it was a big chain at the time. I can't believe I forgot the name. But
Borders.
Yeah, Borders. Yeah. Borders. Yeah, Borders books. And the Islam. This was in Westchester County, New York. That's where I lived at the time, which is about an hour outside of New York City. And so, the bookshelf, the Islam shelf, had been pretty much cleared out when I went to figure out, I wanted to go buy a Quran, and I wanted to start getting some books so I could start writing and thinking and all of that. And one of the books I came to was a book by Ibn Warraq, who is an ex-Muslim, and he wrote a book called Why I Am Not a Muslim. And it's a very fascinating overview of all of these issues. But one thing that he has said, because he loves his family, he has family members who don't even know he left Islam, and he writes under a pseudonym, and he still has obviously family bonds and so on. But he says that it's not that there is no such thing as a moderate Muslim. However, there is no moderate Islam. And so there is wiggle room for anybody inside any sort of system, but the system itself is what we would call extreme. It's not exceptional. It is sanctioned by the Quranic mainstream writings, the Quran itself, the Hadith, the Surah, all of these bases for the religion sanction these things. And so whether somebody is fallen away or leaves it, and you have to keep that secret because apostasy is a capital crime in Islam. It is literally a death penalty offense to leave Islam. But if you are, finding a new way on your own, that's a separate issue. But in terms of the Sharia, which we see Sharia courts, I think they first started coming into England probably about over a dozen years ago, family courts to be determined by Sharia, which have all kinds of inequality for women. Women need this would be a criminal case, but under the Sharia, women need 4 witnesses to a rape to bring charges, the inheritance laws, etc., very anti-woman. So these kinds of things start seeping into society, regardless of a moderation of an individual. So that is kind of where I'm coming from. It's very important to keep the tenets and the mainstream classical sources of this in mind.
Do you feel like in all your research, because I look at this and I think, especially, let's talk about Europe for a second, because to me, it's the European governments, these countries that allowed all this. I mean, I know Belgium is way out of hand, England, France, Ireland. My friend Matt Bracken was just over Ireland. Germany,
Denmark,
Spain,
Norway.
Spain and Italy, part of this too?
All of them to varying degrees. You're right. You're absolutely right. This had to be enabled. And this is where I get to the next big thought I wanted to throw around, which has to do with what is sometimes referred to as the red-green axis. So red being communism, green being Islam. Why would the two work together? We're looking at the influence of these governments. These are not native Islamic governments. These are European, for the most part. I mean, England has very much changed to a lot of Islamic British people who now run cities, but they're Islamic, the mayors and so on, and so many of that. But I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the native born, the indigenous peoples of Europe enabled this, or their governments, certainly. What you're looking at is the confluence, the sort of affinity of totalitarianism. And what I mean by that is despotism, or we call it in the 20th century totalitarianism, and Islam have great commonality. The control factor, the control of Islam is not just controlling the politics of the world. There is the law, and there is a law that comes down to your most personal behavior, literally, including how you wash yourself and things like that, and which hand goes first, and various extremely private acts. These are all written out, and in terms of law. So it is there's been numerous historians pretty much between the middle of the 19th century and the middle of the 20th century who made these observations about how, before we come to the word totalitarian, but how despotic Islam is, the control system, law, religion, culture, everything under control and written out. And then when you marry that to the strain of Marxism that became Bolshevism first, after the Russian Revolution and so on, there is tremendous synergy between them as control systems. And so you see numerous thinkers, experts in Sharia law, experts in communism, coming to this very interesting conclusion that I think does explain why you see this red-green axis. Look at the latest anti-Trump, anti-Netanyahu protest that's been called in Washington, D.C., outside the White House. If you look at the sponsors, you see numerous Palestine-related groups. You see Code Pink, which is Marxist. You see the FRSO, which is the socialist Chinese group. And, so you see the different sorts of more or less jihadist type organizations. Red green. I mean, it's interesting because they seem to have different issues. But one of the greatest thoughts that came out for helping us understand these revolutionary movements that came out of the 60s was someone who said the issue is never the issue is always the revolution. And both of these systems are against the society of the Judeo-Christian society that has evolved, out of over the millennia to this point. And so they have a common enemy. And that's why you see this allegiance. And going back, 20 some years, I started covering the anti-EU, anti-Islamic immigration parties that were coming up in Europe. And this would be Vlaams Belang or Vlaams Blok before that, Vlaams Belang in Belgium, the Danish People's Party, many others, the Swiss People's Party. I actually had a wonderful summer where I traveled around Europe interviewing the leaders of these parties, which was a truly spectacular experience. But they were, when they achieved power, when they got votes, those parliamentary systems, there's so many little parties, it's very difficult. You have to find coalitions. But whenever they would seem to come toward a leadership role in whether it was a city or larger, the left and the Islamic groups would bond. The red-green axis would create what they call a cordon sanitaire against them. And you've seen that as recently in the last year or so when Geert Wilders, whom I interviewed many years ago, I was the first American newspaper journalist to interview him. He is now the head of the leading party in the Netherlands. I interviewed him when he was a party of one. He was the only guy. But he's the leading party. And, by rights, he should have been able to form a coalition and become prime minister. That's the way the system works. But this intense cordon sanitaire was able to, it's been kind of a mess. And a lot of horse trading, et cetera, going on. But it just shows how that works. And so it's, again, Geert Wilders is a good one to think about because he has been one of the most outspoken, free-speaking figures of our century, of our times, in terms of seeing Islam as a problem in Western society, as a threat to Western society. And he's documented, he's lived it. He's been living under death threats since, I believe, 2004, if you remember, when Theo van Gogh was assassinated in a ritual Islamic assassination on a street in Amsterdam for having made a short film about the condition of women in Islam. So this goes back, 20 years, but why aren't we talking about this? Why aren't we thinking about these things? I think Geert Wilders has been living under state security ever since then. I have a journalist friend in Denmark who lives under state security. He was almost assassinated by Al-Qaeda back about 10 years ago. He lives under state protection. This is what's going on, and we don't talk about it, and we just pretend it's not there, which when you get down to it and you start studying this notion of dhimmitude, this condition of
can you explain,
acting as if...
I was going to say, well, can you explain the definition of dhimmitude?
Yes. It's a brilliant term that takes this Arabic word dhimmi. Dhimmi is literally, in the original definition, are people of the book, Jews and Christians, the people of the Bible, who can stay people of the Bible under an Islamic system if they agree to be under the protection, quote unquote, of the Islamic authorities, which basically means they live as a very low caste, subject to humiliation, violence, and attacks for being Jewish or Christian. And there's a whole history of the dhimmi that in our time has been marvelously explicated. And I greatly, recommend people looking at the books of a historian named Bat Yeor, Yeor. That is a pen name, means daughter of the Nile. She comes from a very old Jewish family from Egypt who was expelled under Nasser in the 1950s. And she ended up becoming this incredible scholar of the lives, the histories of the non-Muslims living under Islam. And she also coined the phrase or the word Eurabia as well to describe this sort of Dimitude-like situation between Europe and Arabia, which actually, well, no, she didn't. I have to call that back. She did not coin that phrase. There was actually a magazine that was set up to foster this kind of Euromed organization, Eurabia. But anyway, so Dimitude would extend to people who are not officially under Islamic authority. And that to me would describe the attitude of Westerners to the Danish cartoons. Oh, you mustn't show them. You mustn't make them mad. You mustn't say anything. Shh, don't say anything. That in a nutshell is this internalization of the Sharia against criticizing Muhammad, which is considered blasphemy. So the Western world has essentially already come under these laws of blasphemy that are Islamic. So Dimitude is that condition, and it stymies our thinking. It also allows space for further Islamization, further expansion of the Sharia, which is completely antithetical to every right and liberty we have. They don't coexist. And it even goes back more than to a constitutional situation. One of the most interesting things I learned, and you don't learn it right away because so much of this stuff is concealed or you have to keep reading. But I learned at some point that Islam has no prohibition on lying, as obviously Judaism, the 10 commandments, thou shalt not lie. There is not a correlate in the religion of Islam, because Muslims are allowed to lie to advance Islam or protect Islam or advance a Muslim or protect a Muslim. This is part of the law. So that to me, again, takes us back to communism, which also has no moral absolutes. This is something Solzhenitsyn writes about. And I go through a lot of this with the documentation in both The Death of the Grown-Up and American Betrayal. So because in a sense, both of those books and really all of my work, I think, is guided by this drive to conserve and protect and expand our diminished liberty. I feel we are very diminished as a people when we can't have these conversations. I mean, you and I are having it. That's wonderful. But you know what I mean, in the wider space. And then when it gets to a point where you see states acting, America, other great nations acting as if none of this is happening, none of this history and law and this structure does not exist under the surface, under the smiles. And that's another part of Islam. There is something called taqiyya, which is the word for deception, again, to advance Islam, to advance the jihad, advance the Sharia. These are things that Occidentals, if you will, do not assume when they go into a meeting and when they shake hands. So all of this information is there, all of this history is there, all of this suffering is there, and yet it has been erased from our reflection on what to do, how to do it, how to go forward, how to fix things. It's just gone. And so if you don't know what you're looking at, of course you're going to be ultimately transformed by it.
Well, and I think that, one of the biggest things in terms of success is, people think that, this is my perception, so take this for what it is. But, when Trump got back in, free speech would be restored and everything's going to be fine. And I push back on that. And I say, it's accomplished. They've accomplished exactly what they need to accomplish because you are scared to speak or you hesitate for anything. now, no matter what.
Yeah. Yes, well, that is the fear mechanism. It's not unique to Islam. I mean, we see that in any, again, a totalitarian system depends on controlling people's thoughts. You know, you could have, and again, in American Betrayal, I have various thinkers talking about these same um, uh, uh, systems to control speech, whether it's Nazism, communism, or Islam. And the words you use become very strictly dictated. There are certain words you can use, there are certain words you can't use. In fact, during the Bush years, going back to the post 9/11 period, there was actually this document that came out of the Bush administration called Words That Work. And it wanted you to be able to talk about the war, the extremism, the terrorism without ever mentioning Islam or jihad or any of these things I'm trying to explain, because they have been, again, they are not allowed to be spoken. And when something is verboten, you know that something's wrong, and you know that you, as you're feeling, are being controlled. And there's one other point that I did want to put across that I think is really important for people when they're thinking about red green axis and what is she really talking about. There was a very notorious terrorist, probably going back to I guess the 60s, if not before, 60s, 70s, whose nom de guerre was Carlos the Jackal. Ilich Sanchez Ramirez was his name. He was from Venezuela. His parents were devout Stalinists. In fact, he was named for, Ilich being Lenin, part of Lenin's name. And he became probably the first, maybe one of the first non-Muslim terrorists in the Palestinian movement. He later converted himself to Islam in prison. But I think he killed personally 83 people. He was involved in all kinds of mass terror events in the 70s. And anyway, he wrote a book, and in it he said that the only thing that could ever take the United States down would be an alliance of Marxists and Islamists. So this, again, is this notion of this red-green kind of axis. And it's something, again, as I was saying, with the anti-Trump or anti-Iran action or anti-Netanyahu, it's always these groups are working together. International Answer, and the Palestine this, or the Muslim Brotherhood that. I mean, they have tremendous synergy, and it's right there in plain sight. But again, we certainly don't discuss communism. We certainly don't discuss Islam. Some people talk a little bit about communism now. Back when Obama was running, you couldn't say the word.
Is that your phone, Diana, that's beeping? Or is that your phone that's beeping?
Oh, yeah. Sorry about that.
That's okay. I keep looking at mine, and I'm like,
yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Yeah. No, that's okay. It's a good point to hear what you think of that. I'll just say.
So what ended up happening? What was the fate of that person? What was his name again?
Oh, Carlos the Jackal?
Yeah.
I assume he died in prison, but I'm not 100% sure. He could still be with us, I suppose. I don't think so. I think he's gone. Not sure if he's still with us.
So
he was put in prison at a certain point.
And permanently.
Mm-hmm.
Oh. When did the origin then of the red-green become obvious that it was a partnership, if not marriage?
Well, that's a really good question, and I had a thought today that I think might bear on that. I was looking back. I was trying to figure out what year it was that Yasser Arafat, who of course was the founder of the PLO terrorist group, went to the UN, and it told the assembly there that Jesus Christ was the first Fedayeen, or Palestinian terrorist. This was kind of a shocker, but it gets to what I see in the current debate, this effort to disparage, humiliate, in this Islamic way, to cut Israel off from Christianity that seems to be going on, that is part of the Palestinian movement historically. That's, as I think you can see in that Arafat comment, there is this notion, and this is something common in Islam. Islam comes around in 800 AD, right? And everywhere that it spread, the books always say it's spread, but there would be these jihads and people would be given the choice of convert or die, or there'd be these stealth jihads and so on. But it spread very violently, to say the least. But where it spread, there was obviously a very ancient civilization. And this, of course, is true in the Middle East, where there are many Christian communities and many, many other kinds, Zoroastrians, many other minorities you've never even heard of, who all had these little groups that have been completely expunged by Islam. But when this idea that you sort of pre-Islamize everything, even though Islam doesn't come until well after, 800 years after Jesus Christ. So this is a typical Islamization technique. And bear in mind what happens on the left when they don't like the prehistory to them. We see statues go down, we see histories rewritten. So there again, we see this kind of same totalitarian attitude toward fact and history and existence. So this particular movement, which came up with the whole PLO movement, I think it's important to remember that Arafat, the PLO, many of these terrorist groups were sponsored by the Soviet Union. And so when we see the terrorist groups that spring up at that time, and we see this battering ram really at the connection between the Old Testament and the New Testament, Judaism and Christianity, the effort to actually Islamize Jesus Christ and Mary and the apostles. I mean, this is part of it, this idea, and it's something that's going on today in a lot of these sort of ecumenical outreach, Islam, Christian outreach. There's a lot of these things that are going on where you see something coalescing that is ultimately not just leaving Judaism and Israel or Jews or the Old Testament out in the cold. It's undermining Christianity. It's a very dangerous movement. So when did this? I think in the modern time we would look at this, and others may have a better sense of this, but I would think once we see the Islamic world becoming oil rich and so on after World War II, and we start seeing the rise of this, the weapon of terrorism as very deeply and extensively and continually supported by the Soviet Union, I think you can see it as a weapon against the West. And I would say that's probably when we can first see it coming up in our time.
Now,
but someone's going to say, oh, but I'm forgetting his name, but the Palestinian leader who aligned with Hitler, is that part of it? That's another aspect of it. But in terms of, I guess, red, green, specifically communist, Islamic, that would be more that the age of terror would probably be an initiate. But remember, Nazism is socialism. All of these totalitarian creeds have great similarities. And it's also worth mentioning, just because I do know it, and we're still talking, that, Hitler was a great admirer of Islam. And he lamented the fact that Germany had never been Islamized in those waves that beset Europe. And because he thought it would have created a better warrior. So, it's this stuff has been percolating and getting into into our understanding, and that's why it's so frustrating when there is such a successful censorship movement against all of this stuff, which shouldn't just be erupting from me off the top of my head, but it should be part of our leaders' understanding and our commentators' understanding of what they're looking at.
I want to sidetrack for a second in regards to Hitler,
Sure.
Being, admirer of Islam. So was the end goal then, or in the beginning, to partner with Russia, and then it backfired? Because if they're mirrored together, the green-red movement, wouldn't they have been more aligned if they'd have worked together?
Aligned with?
They were more aligned. If Hitler was an admirer of Islam, I never heard that before, so that's why a question popped into my head. Hitler being an admirer of Islam and Russia being communist at that state, wouldn't it have made more sense if they would have stayed together rather than Germany continuing forward?
Islam wasn't really happening back then in terms of it was in a very degraded state in its own terms. The decline, the end of the Ottoman Empire after World War One. I mean, there was great poverty, and there wasn't much threat to the West. They didn't have much to muster at that time, so it wasn't as if they would find a great ally, except in this rather limited fashion where there were alliances with the Nazi armies. But um, in terms of Russia and Hitler, of course, they were allied, and then Germany attacked Russia, and they were no longer allied. But there's I don't know where you want to go with that
No,
exactly.
no, I knew that, but I mean, in terms
Oh,
of, it, would they have been smarter strategically if they would have just, stayed with them rather than to keep marching forward? And what had changed if if the green red was, that partnership, had would it have been, I guess I'm getting my words messed up here, but would it have benefited that for Germany to just stick with Russia rather than to keep moving forward?
to stick with Russia. Oh, well, there was a lot going on there. I mean, there's a very strong argument to be made that, Hitler was, there's a historian named Suvorov who calls Hitler was used as the icebreaker to war in Europe by Stalin. I mean, there's all kinds of places to go with that in terms of why they did not stay aligned. But there's all kinds of things that were working it there, but the Islamic question was not anywhere first and foremost because they were not military powers at that time.
So it wasn't factored in at that point.
Right.
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 Yeah.
Except in that one instance with that brigade, or whatever they were trying to do in that particular region of the war down in the Palestine Israel area, or it wasn't Israel yet.
So why do you think now people will not speak on these subjects?
Well, I think it is ultimately the lessons of Dimitude. It is ultimately the lessons of fear. The state embraced the censorship, and the media embraced the censorship. I remember back in the day of the Danish cartoons. This was a very big moment for Western freedom and freedom of speech. It was, you could not get those cartoons printed in a newspaper. And I remember at the time there was a lovely man, a cartoonist at the Washington Times named Bill Garner, and he was just torn up over not being allowed to cartoon in solidarity with the Danes by the editors, and I think he ended up putting an empty pane for his commentary one day, trying to say something. But the idea that the Western media didn't all publish them together and just say, we don't do this. We have cartoons about our leaders, about Jesus Christ, about anybody. We say what we want. This was a surrender. And remember, the Islam, the word means submission. It is, again, this kind of backdoor into this very diminished state. And in the death of the grown-up, that was the metaphor. There is no grown-up talk. There is no assumption of your full sovereign rights as a free citizen if you absolutely are afraid to talk. And then when you look at the history of Islamic conquest, it is the same trait in the subject peoples. They are fearful to a point of physical fear and all the rest of it. But what's happening today in our own countries? We have terrorist attacks. We have all manner of truck and car jihad. We have knife jihad throughout Europe. We have the Christmas markets are beset. These are the hallmarks of jihad, and they're treated as if they are simply a matter of juvenile delinquency or criminality. And it's probably one of the great frustrations of my life just as an observer, just watching. It's like being living in this quarter century nightmare where you can't scream, or the scream can't be heard. I scream plenty, but the scream is ignored, or put down, or the cool people won't listen to you. And not that I would have ever cared anything about that, but that is how it functions. And and it's whether it's any of these conflicts that we've been involved in, it's always the same. There is this: how do you make a strategy when you are ignoring the traits, the most important identifiers of your enemy? So it's amazing. And then further, in Iraq and Afghanistan, both, the Americans literally helped birth or create the constitutions of both those countries that we had supposedly taken control of to be Sharia compliant documents. So I always said it was, America is fighting to make the world safe for Sharia. So, this is a big piece of it, again, that is undiscussed. And when I took that trip to Europe and interviewed numerous leaders of these political parties, these parties trying very hard to get control of their borders, basically from the EU and from the Islamic immigration. I, didn't have a whole lot of time with anybody. I would meet them and, spend an hour or two with them, I guess, maybe sometimes more. But I had a couple, I wanted to know their attitudes toward the EU. And back in the day, and maybe still to this point, they were being castigated and demonized and slandered as Nazis, the Nazi right wingers, the far right, this and that. So I had this technique. I was interested in their attitude toward Israel as part of my list of questions. What do you think of whatever was happening at the time? It seemed like it would start an interesting conversation. And what I was very intrigued by, and almost to a man, they saw Israel as the front line of the jihad that they were trying to prevent from coming to Europe. And so this is what I mean by Judeo-Christian. There is, and again, people of the book, the dhimmi, are the first book people, the Jews, and the second book people, or the Old Testament people and the New Testament people. They're together. And what happens to one happens to the other. And they were fully aware of this. And they saw Israel's fight as being something that was helping them by, in so many ways, their enemies were tied down by Israel. I mean, it's been a long time. There's been so much Islamic immigration since I was in Europe interviewing them. I don't know if they would feel that jihad was as far away at all anymore, but that was their understanding. They were very steeped in what Islam was. And remember, Europe is small. The countries are small. The cities, people are packed in. When they started getting these influxes from Morocco, Pakistan, etc., everybody's aware of it, especially middle class and lower middle class people. The poor people really suffer the most because they can't move to the nice gated community or the equivalent thereof. So people really understood. They learned about jihad in ways that nobody in America seemed to have any concept of. And they created these popular movements, and they were very brave. I walked around with them on these streets. I thought they were terribly brave to go out and give their message freely, but they felt it was, so important to speak freely. And one thing I came to at a certain point, we have the First Amendment, but we don't use it. They don't have a First Amendment. They don't have these protections, but they have been consistently much more honest, open, and just themselves, trying to protect their people and their civilization. So we have a lot to learn from them. But again, they too have been, kind of lost to us. You don't see them interviewed on the big shows and so on. So, again, we're left in the dark.
Do you think would you go to Europe at this point?
As a tourist or a journalist?
Either or.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't be averse to it. I would look at it as, a more of a fact finding than a pleasure trip at this point. As it has been. I mean, back in the day, I got tours of the Islamic neighborhoods, and I don't know if I would have to go somewhere as much, just because there has been such, after Angela Merkel's big movement, well, going back about 10 years, there's been so much more. So I don't know how it would look right now.
Well, and I asked that for two fronts. One, which you already addressed, but the other side of it is because of the censorship has been, more of a tight grip, would you hesitate because of what you do speak about, what you do
Oh,
post on
oh,
X? Would
yes.
you?
Well, that's true. I hadn't even thought of that. No, I might hesitate on that. I know for something completely unrelated, I violated um, one of their D notices in England on an unrelated case involving Vladimir Bukovsky. So I was actually told, don't go to England. They'll definitely pick you up. So I guess there are other places as well that might be dangerous. I don't know, but it's uh, it's horrifying. It's a horrifying. The lack of concern and understanding and will to understand and will to speak about it to me is worse than the immigration itself that's changing these countries. There's something so horrific watching people just pretend it's not there for the most part, and watching the governments enforce it. And you mentioned that earlier. They are to blame. I mean, this wouldn't happen if the governments didn't want to see it happen. And I think that's a very important point that we have to understand about our own government as well, in terms of what happens on the ground, what laws are enforced, what laws are not enforced. If the government wants it to happen, and I would include that with some of the street takeovers, the violence. Right now, we just today, I haven't read the stories yet, but horrible news about attacks on ICE officers and so on coming down. I mean, we're looking at an insurgency. This, according to the textbook definition, we're looking at insurgency, and the question becomes, what will happen? Who will enforce what? Despite what it is that President Trump stands for or wishes to stand for. So all of these things did not have to happen. None of this had to happen. So you come back to, what is the big plan? What is the giant end game? And always open to speculation, but clearly we have people being killed by the science and the medical world, and we have our civilization being erased, churches turning to mosques and neighborhoods becoming completely deracinated from anything that came before them. I mean, these are the countries that gave us music and literature and poetry. And for me, on England, one of the things I always heard, I was an English major in college, and the whole chivalric code and the notion of the elevation of the middle to upper class, let us say, English woman, American woman as well. American and English women from middle, I'm not talking about, people who have a terrible time in life, but there was this elevation of the female that has been utterly lost for many reasons, including, I would say, heavy Marxist attack on the family and the family structure. But we also look at the rape gangs in Europe, in England, which seems to be a more British form of this type of jihad, certainly very common in Britain, that have been ignored for 30, 40 years and longer. I mean, some of this stuff started right at the very beginning of the Islamic immigration after World War II. So the cover-ups are intense, and the people who speak out of them, like a Tommy Robinson, they get thrown in jail. And so but that is the state structure. That is not an Islamic, it's not coming from Qatar or Iran. That is a British structure who may be beholden to Iran or Qatar. I don't know, but it's all depends on our silence. And I guess that's my bottom line, that this is silence, and we are doomed, blind, if we're silent.
What do you think is the end game of all this?
Well,
let me ask you on two fronts. Let me
yeah.
interrupt you for a second. What do you think the end game is in Europe, and what is the end game in the United States if they're different? So let's start with Europe.
Well, I think they're only different insofar as the regions are different. We have different customs and different spatial situations. America is so spread out, so it's going to be different. And we have a massive Hispanic movement here that came through the immigration that essentially, in my lifetime, changed. For example, I come from Los Angeles, and when I was growing up, Los Angeles was a vastly high majority white city, which I think most people would find incredible. I'm not that old. I mean, you can go up to 1970 into the 1980, and you're still probably 75% a white city, which is kind of amazing. What happened, massive influx. So you've got a Hispanization of a European derived country, which I think is very sad. There are a lot of Hispanic countries. There are a lot of Islamic countries. It's not the European derived culture is very small in this world. It's very small, and it is being overrun. And I think that is an end game of numerous kinds of theorists who want everywhere to be, except the the home countries are always the same. You can go back to any country in the Islamic world or Africa or South America, and it's going to be home to you. You're going to find your favorite food and your family connections, and everything is going to be the same. But they want. I do think there is an assault on European Judeo-Christian civilization. So I think that is the ultimate end game. And then who emerges at the end, I don't know. Will it be Russia and China? As usual, I don't know. It feels that way. I mean, it does feel that has always been probably a prize for those countries doctrinally to eventually control this landmass. So maybe that's an end game. Certainly, we know about the theories about shrinking population and controlling population and robots and transhumanism. There's such a toxic mix of threats. It's really hard to pretend that you have any clear sight on any one of them, but you just see them all coming. They're all around. And lately, the Islamic threat has come back up in my sights. I would say I took a break for a while after American Betrayal, and I would say a lot of these issues somewhat subsided. America got out of Iraq, got out of Afghanistan. There was less burn on some of these issues, certainly in the first Trump administration, if I'm not being wildly amnesiac or something. But it seemed to me it was not, Israel was not as big an issue in general. It's interesting. It sort of pops up and pops down as being the sort of locus on which the world seems to turn, which of course it doesn't. But all of these things, I guess, that I'm talking about do drive against this civilization, Western civilization, drive against the family, which is the basis of Western civilization. So I guess that is the commonality of all of it.
Do you feel like what you just stated in regards to Europe applies to the United States as well in terms of endgame?
Yes. Yes, of course. We're bigger. We're bigger. People can be more insulated from a lot of these things depending where you live. But, look at the state of Texas. There are numerous, essentially, Islamic communities forming that are part of this extension of Sharia into America. And it is a threat if you like freedom of religion, you like freedom of speech. It's not a casual kind of new wave of immigration. It's a very different kind of immigration, and it's a very different culture and religion and law. And it is at loggerheads with our own. And that's what people have been taught not to appreciate.
Yeah, I've become more of a, I don't want to say believer, but the whole depopulation makes a lot more sense to me, especially after COVID. You saw,
After COVID. Mm-hmm.
and even I also think that whatever they can do to continue to divide people, like I believe 100% they will. I mean, and even take example of the drugs, the drug flow that are coming to this country. I don't think they were ever interested in stopping it because I don't think they really care that, and this is just in my opinion, I don't think they really care that, hundreds of thousands of people overdose every year.
I think that's true because it could, again, another thing that could be stopped. The drug war is a really interesting one because back in the day, there was tremendous, a long time ago, there was understanding that a lot of the drugs were being used as another weapon of the communist world, particularly China, against the Western world, against America. And this was something that was, again, President Nixon didn't want to hear about things like that as he was trying to, quote, open China. I mean, these are aspects of it. There's a really interesting book called Red Cocaine that goes into the organization of these drug networks that were essentially seen as a way to completely demoralize America by hooking youth and so on. And then when you marry that to the things we know now about the CIA role in LSD and even maybe the creation of the counterculture itself, you start again looking at these strange convergences of bad guys that are both foreign and homegrown, but it's that's another mare's nest.
But also too with that is and I've talked about this in regards to China and questions that I've popped up in my own head. It's like, okay, we've painted this picture of China being the enemy. Well, who let them into the universities? The United States government did.
Exactly. No, exactly.
Who slept
Well,
with their Chinese spies? Sorry to interrupt you, but who slept with the Chinese spy? Like
Yeah, of course.
We allowed all this.
Of course. And then, the response is headlines, and then it just moves on. But the universities really deserve a special mention in all of this, not just because of the intense war on the campuses of places like Columbia ever since October 7th. But when you think about the violent and really completely anti-Western ethos of the dominant voices of these, protesters and so on that have come up advocating for terrorist groups, Hamas. I mean, it wasn't even sugar-coated in any way. There's no space. It was very shocking to a lot of people, I think. But when you think about that, there were college admissions interviews of all these people. And there were other people who didn't get in, who probably didn't have that in their background, that sort of tendency or that kind of, summer internships with, I don't know what, UNRWA or something. But, these colleges created these cadres, because that's what they are. They're revolutionary cadres. And the professors, right now, there's been a Socialism 2025 conference, and there's a Twitter account. His name is Stu, and I don't know his actual handle. It's a little more complicated, like Stu Studio, but you should check it out because he's been clipping the speeches of these people, and it is openly revolutionary. It's so blatant in terms of tearing everything down and discussing how they're using the college's money to do that and how they're raising up these revolutionaries and I mean, it's so blatant you can't even believe it. And these are professors from Princeton and University of Pittsburgh or this or that or wherever they're from. They're from everywhere, and they're just sitting there with with their little water bottles talking about revolution. And I thought to myself, that professor from Princeton, she had to apply. She had to go through probably several interviews at least. They read her stuff. They hired her. So again, the intent is very important to understand. None of this is just happening to us. The big education, big government, big pharma, big everything, they are doing this. And then we are left to figure it out or hide from it or shut up. So don't shut up.
What do you think the future of academia is?
Well, unless they fire everybody and fumigate, I don't think it really has a future. I can't imagine being a parent with college-age kids and sending them. I mean, honestly, I think I'd rather give them the money to invest or travel or something, or hire a tutor if they're so inclined, or get their trade school degree or something like that. I mean, these are revolutionary incubators, and so difficult. I mean, look, there was a op-ed in the New York Post about a computer science PhD at MIT who withdrew from the program because he was harassed and pressured and terrorized so much for being Jewish that he left what was his dream. He was fulfilling his dream, being a PhD. I mean, he has to be pretty smart, right? To be a PhD computer science at MIT, and he withdrew. So this is what is tolerated. it's very easy. You just say you can't do that. You're out. But they don't.
Yeah, I mean, I think I told you I was in Penn State last week, and I lived there over 20 years ago, and I was in the downtown area, and I don't know if you've ever been there, but
No, I haven't.
it's beautiful. I mean, it's right in the middle of the state. Beautiful
Yeah.
campus, beautiful town. But I get down there, and I saw this a couple of years ago when I went back, so it didn't shock me. But just the pride flags everywhere around the town, like just. And I know it's the
Yeah.
town, not the university, but I just think to myself, here's this beautiful college, and I'm like, what is the future of these big institutions?
Yeah.
Now, their endowments are probably so large that they'll be able to stay afloat, like Harvard, and I don't know that any of those Ivy League schools will ever go anywhere because they just have so much money coming in. But I also wonder, even from the smaller schools, because all these universities, I was down at UVA in Charlottesville, and my friend that was with me was so surprised how left leaning it was. I'm like, they're all like
Oh,
this.
they're all that way. Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. Well, their student bodies will start, I'm sure already have started winnowing down. I mean, you're not going to get the creme de la creme if it's so violent and radical and anti-American, and so that will happen to them. They may not care. I don't know. It seems like a lot of these people don't really depend on the bottom line, or don't depend on the kinds of normal prods that most people have. They're so on fire. So who knows how long the gravy train will last with them? But they're just absolutely shameful and embarrassing. They're an embarrassment at this point, but they're dangerous. They're a great place for people to go and organize revolutions. And we've seen that. We've seen that with Mohsen Madawi at Columbia and the other Khalil. And, you're seeing this, and it is allowed, it is tolerated and encouraged ultimately. So where does that go? I mean, you see things, there's a group on Twitter called Unity of Fields, and Steve Coughlin will tell you as he posts that it is Hamas. And they are openly communicating all kinds of revolutionary, violent messaging across to their followers. And that's fine. It's on Twitter. So, what is tolerated? What kind of crucible are they really, who knows, but are we headed for with this kind of strife and violence, the uptick, and certainly the people should be really concerned about the violence against federal officers, ICE officers, and so on. I mean, this is an insurgency. That is how it is defined, as an insurgency, to have this kind of organized assaults on officers of the law, in this particular case, especially with the immigration law. So this is very alarming. And again, everything is a fear factor. And it's not just from Islam. Any totalitarian, lawless, might makes right organization strikes the fear of God into people so they submit. And so a lot of this stuff has the effect of cowing people.
You know,
And
oh, sorry.
yeah, no, no.
So you bring up an interesting point with the ICE, because I look at, especially the day of the protests, which I can't remember the date off the top of my head because it was right when I left Arizona, so it had been June, maybe it was June, I don't know, whatever, the second Saturday of June, third Saturday of June, whatever that was, the No Kings protest. And I think it was a couple days or a week before, they send these ICE agents into LA, the garment district, and you're just like, okay, well, they didn't have sufficient backup.
Right.
Was this all a setup? I literally step back and I look at all this, and I'm
Yeah.
like, is this all one big setup to just keep dividing people and to lead into some type of conflict to where the country will come in, the government will come in, and I haven't been shy about my feelings towards technology and where this ultimately is
Yeah.
going,
Yeah.
with the tech bros and Palantir and all this stuff, for people to be like, yeah, we need this,
We need this.
and next
Yeah,
thing you
I know. It's
know,
always felt like that. Yeah.
they put these measures in place, like right after
Yeah.
9/11, Homeland Security, TSA, what have you. People are cheering for it, and then it never goes away.
Right. Right. Well, I mean, you could,
I kind of went top there, so I mean, and this could
well,
take us
no,
whole.
it's,
If you have the time, I mean, this could take us
yeah,
down a whole nother hour conversation. But
I think so. Yeah. Well, it's an interesting one. We've been talking a bit about 9/11 as a start point in this modern period, our contemporary times. And 9/11 ends up becoming, well, one, a catalyst for the expansion of Islam, because you see immediately the government, the US government, Bush administration starts this massive outreach to Muslims, including all of a sudden instituting all kinds of Islamic holidays and outreach into, different government sectors, the military and the rest of it, and inculcating all these new Sharia requirements of the military and so on. So there's that. And then what we all feel much more intensely is the rise of the security state, which the Patriot Act, et cetera, becomes um, the superstructure, rises over 9/11, and has been turned against many of us at this point. So it is very troubling, the whole thing. One thing I looked into at one point was after Oklahoma City, which took place during the Clinton administration,
have you ever been to that
1996.
memorial? 95. Have you ever been to that memorial, Diana?
I have not.
It's unbelievable. I've actually been to it. It's on. My sister lived there at one point, and it is one of the most unbelievable memorials that I've ever seen.
Why?
Because I went at night, so I didn't get to do the tour. You could do the tour where you could hear the 911 call,
Uh-huh.
but you walk into this. I'm gonna get it wrong, but it was like it felt like an outdoor track feel, and they had chairs for with names on them of all the adults that were
Oh,
killed,
wow.
and then they had
Yeah.
smaller chairs for all the children, and
Oh
it
my
was all
God.
lit up at night. And
Wow.
I had never seen
Yeah.
that before.
No,
Uh,
I haven't ever heard it described, actually. That's interesting.
I don't know that I would
Well,
go there
I
out of
was
my way.
gonna,
I wouldn't know that I would go out of my way to go to it. But
yeah,
if you were traveling
very
through on a road
striking.
trip,
Yeah.
it's worth the stop to see it.
Yeah. Well, it'd be nice if I felt like they ever got to the bottom of it too, but we never really get to the bottom of these things. But what I was going to say about that incident, that assault, was there was immediately legislation brought, or under advocated by the Clinton White House for a Patriot Act like, terrorism enhanced powers, basically. And in that mid 1990s period, there were enough civil libertarian types, or just American citizens, who thought we should have more privacy and right to ourselves, without becoming suspects for no reason, without the Fourth Amendment, et cetera, blah, blah, blah. But it got turned back. And so it was definitely a follow on to Oklahoma City, in the way that 5 years later, the Patriot Act would be a follow on to 9/11, and worked. We got the basically the cancellation of the Fourth Amendment out of that, and all the surveillance, et cetera. But I always thought it was kind of interesting that that was the federal response in the 90s, and that there was enough pushback that it just had to go away pretty much. They may have passed something, but it wasn't nearly the powers that they had hoped to extract in the wake of Oklahoma City.
And that was back then, right? I
And
mean,
that was back then,
yeah.
yeah.
And then you have, and I wasn't even aware of what you just said. Um, but and then you have 9/11, and again, I've made no secret of where I thought this is ultimately going, with a authoritarian technology controlling
Yeah,
society. But I see it happening globally, and at this
yeah,
point, I don't think you can
yeah,
stop it. I mean, do you think we still
yeah.
have a First Amendment in this country?
No, no, I don't. And I can say that with just in for any number of reasons. But I was recently in touch with a writer who has a true life, incredible story to tell. And it involves the federal government, but it's all true, it's all documented, et cetera. And he is scared to death, with reason, um, about lawsuits, from the feds, kind of thing, or punishment or retribution. And the First Amendment, it's such a, if you get a good judge, you might get the First Amendment case adjudicated wisely, but if you don't, you won't. And so it's become it used to be such a strong and just encompassing protection, and I don't feel that it is anymore. it's whimsical again, which is a marker of, not whimsical, it sounds like such a nice word, but it's mercurial at this point. And that is another marker of this kind of totalitarianism where things are one law for some, one law for another, which if you look at the Islamic system, you have certain laws for Muslims, you have certain laws for the other people. If you look at communism, Maoism, for example, you have what people will call two-tiered justice. You'll have justice that the hammer comes down on the patriots, basically the traditionalists, and the left, the revolutionary vanguard, doesn't have any law applied to them. Well, we see that. We see all of these things, and they do align. You can't make them not align if you're looking at them factually. So again, that is the affinity of totalitarianism. And I think ultimately that's sort of the main concern I have, that totalitarianism in all its guises needs to be acknowledged because it is a threat to people who love liberty.
This writer of yours, is this person, so they're not public?
No, I don't want to give any clues. It was just really struck me because um, uh, 10 years ago, I would have just said, oh, come on, you're fine. You're saying the truth. It's your opinion. You've got it documented, but it's a sensitive matter. And at this point, I think, I don't want to tell you that. I think he has to do what he thinks is right, but I can't say, don't worry, you're protected in good faith or in good feeling, good conscience, because I don't know. And that's a terrible place to be in America. I mean, look at the lawsuits that Robert Malone threw against Dr. Peter Breggin and his wife Ginger Breggin and Jane Ruby for matters of opinion, for a book review that the Breggins wrote. It was such a incredible thing, $25 million lawsuit. And at first you think, oh, that's ridiculous. And it did get thrown out. It got thrown out, but at what cost? And after raising money and all these things, and it should have been laughed out of court right away because it's a First Amendment matter. But we're not at that place anymore. And people can just be so litigious, and you never know. If you get the wrong judge, who knows?
Well, and if these government agencies come after you, and I mean, I've had some of these people on my show on the medical side where they come after you, and even VDARE, if you were following the story with Peter Brimelow and his wife Lydia.
Oh gosh, yes. That was horrific.
I've
Yeah,
had them both on here. I mean, they were the
yeah,
first ones to experience lawfare. I've had Jared
yeah,
Taylor on here,
yeah.
and you get the Letitia James, and they have a blank
Right.
check, and you don't have the financial
Can't
resources
compete.
to
No,
fight that off.
no, no, no. And who wants to and who should have to? I mean, it's all wrong. And so that, the yeah, it's all pretty difficult for people to move freely, at this point in the public square.
And the tech, did you watch the Peter Thiel interview where him talking about transhumanism and
I saw a clip where he's not sure he wants humans to survive. Was it that interview?
yeah, yeah, and he's all like sweaty, I guess, but I guess he always looks like that. He looked like I don't
Oh,
know if he was sweating in the interview, but
yeah.
and you watch
Maybe it
him,
was a hot thing.
you
Yeah,
watch him, and you're just like, wow, this guy, like the power that this man has, and all of these tech
yeah,
people,
yeah,
like and I get people label me. They're like, "You're so negative. You don't have." I'm like, I just think this is where it's going. I think it's
yeah,
inevitable.
yeah. It does feel inevitable. I mean, the digital currency and the
Don't you think the
uh,
digital currency is already here though? Because we use our phone for everything.
yeah. Well, I don't. And so are we going to get to the point where I can't participate in buying groceries? That becomes my question because I made a decision a while ago, and it wasn't really that hard a decision to tell you the truth in terms of my own convenience, but I just decided I really didn't want the phone anymore. I just didn't want it on my person anywhere. And so I haven't used one in a long time. So I'm not doing everything on my phone. I do a lot on my computer, so maybe I'm cheating, but you do wonder at what point it's going to be hard to function without it. And I think they'll probably give us some kind of grace period for all the old people to kind of go away, and people who can't manage it or whatnot. I mean, You look at phone service, that's sort of far afield from our subject, but I have a friend who really doesn't want, she really doesn't want a cell phone. She lives in the country, she's a farmer. And, the phone service that she has is so bad, and there's never going to be anything better. And so they obviously are pushing people from the old line to the digital, and they just don't care. And I think that I heard of another friend whose area had the same kind of old phone service yielding to digital. And I think it's just kind of a process. And it's one small piece of, the larger situation. But at some point, everything's going to be a portal and a digital and a blah, blah, blah. So, but when will food really, food become hostage to digital? I don't know.
Well, but I think like we're going off track here a little bit, but I think it's all tied together in my opinion, because
Yeah.
where they want to take us ultimately, so all these other things that are going on right now is to lead us to a
Yeah.
complete control and
Yeah.
divide us as much as they can, partition it, whether it be Russia, Ukraine, or what's happening in the Middle East, what's happening on the universities.
Yes, yes. And also it becomes our I don't want to say entertainment, but it becomes our passion or our outlet to focus whether you're more interested in Ukraine or Israel, or you're more interested in Islamic immigration, or you're more interested in the trans issue, or you're more interested, there's so many absolutely hot button issues to get really upset about. I mean, to just honestly, everybody is all a boil, it's everything. And so when you step back and you think, well, they're spraying the skies, I don't know what it is, but I see it every day. Or, the toxicity of this, or they're still giving us mRNA. Well, they're still offering and recommending mRNA
People are
shots.
still doing it, Diana. People are still getting
Yeah.
those.
I mean, so what does Ukraine or trans or anything ultimately matter when the kill box is shrinking, coming in, right? It sort of becomes, are we being distracted? And it's not to say these things don't have real world consequences and blood and death and pain. It's not like they're all virtual. I'm not suggesting that, but there is this sometimes I feel that there is this way in which it is a distraction, I guess, from, you know, the insurgency, the rising authoritarian, the digital, that is actually having a greater impact on everyone than what takes place far away or not. And that doesn't really cover the trans thing, which takes place very close. But it's all of these things, the immigration and so on. That is there any way to really bring it about, or will it just inflame? I guess is a question. I think Tom Homan said they've got to do 7,000 a day to even get rid of Biden's influx. And I don't know what they're doing a day. Maybe they say 3,000. I don't know if that's true or not. So
And I think that number is probably so much higher than what they even
I
forecast or
do
what they
too.
estimated during those 4 years. I mean, what did they say? 20 million? It wouldn't
Well,
shock
for
me. It's
about 30
40.
years, they said 11 million, right? I mean, for decades, we kept being told there were 11 million. I think since the the first amnesty, they never changed the number. And then I think we did bump up to 20. So, I mean, I'm sure it's much higher,
What do you?
50, 80.
It doesn't even matter. It's kind of like the debt, right? Like they say the
Yeah,
number
I
for the debt.
guess.
Like, does it even matter
Yeah,
anymore?
yeah, yeah.
But I was someone that wasn't optimistic. I was wrong on where I thought the election was going to go. I thought they would install her again, and just because they had the mechanisms in place from 2020. And I haven't been convinced otherwise, or maybe it's just me being stubborn. But I still believe that the tech people put him back in because it serves their interest, and better to take over MAGA than to try to fight it any longer. Because ultimately,
Yeah,
I think where this is all going is you need these instruments, these tech instruments, in order to
yeah,
implement everything.
yeah. It makes sense. And yeah, there is a massive, well, going back to the Middle East and all of that, this is the split. Israel becomes the split on MAGA. We have the Tucker and the Candace and this Bannon and this group that is, again, in my view, when doing the larger context, doing this sundering of Judaism from Christianity ultimately, and having world events again turn on this locus or focus axis of Israel. Whereas the red green movement is so much, I mean, it is so pernicious and so widespread, and it is changing us so much. And those are things they never talk about. And so it becomes, to me, we're talking about deflections, but I think this becomes this propaganda deflection from all of this other movement that it makes me very leery of the future of MAGA, because it I don't know how deep it goes into the actual people, as opposed to the influencers, who I think are more and more seen a little bit as carnival barkers. I think at this point, I don't think they're doing well in terms of um, being seen as honest brokers, to this at this point. But we'll see. We'll certainly see.
But don't you think too that that's intended to just further the divide, right? And just
Yes, I think
continue
it's
to
supposed to divide MAGA. Yeah.
partition, 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 chop it up,
Mhm.
chop it up, chop it up. I mean, what did you think? I know we've been talking for a while. What did you think about the Epstein stuff that came out last night?
Oh, that there was no list. Wouldn't it be funny if there was no list? I think that the whole thing is such a poisoned well at this point. It's hard to even start over and go back to it. I just go back to, wasn't it Jim Comey's daughter who was the prosecutor on Ghislaine Maxwell? I kind of want to go back there and see why that case did not name any names. Because if you think about what the Justice Department has on Epstein, right? If you think of that concept, they've already brought suit against at least Ghislaine Maxwell. And I've always been left wondering, if there's this massive information that's so incriminating, why didn't it go into the case? So if I were trying to go back and look at it, I think that is where I'd be, rather than at the end game with the strange, seemingly fake files that got released, and Pam Bondi, they're on my desk. Oh, they're, that almost becomes incomprehensible. But what's real was that case. And something went really wrong with James Comey's daughter, Maureen Comey, who I think also was a prosecutor on Diddy, if I'm not mistaken. So something is there. And that's where I would go with it.
Well, and I think that also with that, it's like, would you even believe if a list came out today that it was complete at
Well,
this
I've
point?
always, I've always felt like we kind of had our list in the phone book. I mean, whether everyone there is implicatable in a person like that's phone book, but I mean, we did get a phone book that had an awful lot of people on it, and Bill Clinton's 25 phone numbers for Bill Clinton, things like that. We already have that list, so I've always been sort of operating off of that list, but the phone book list. But yeah, I mean, what you would be very hard to trust the documents, and there are many documents that this Trump Department of Justice is not releasing, and for me, even more than Epstein at this point, again, I would definitely go back to that case, but with the failure to reveal and investigate and probably indict and probably prosecute the perpetrators of January 6th from the Justice Department and the FBI, I think is one of the most outrageous crimes that is in progress at this point, given that we supposedly have the reins of power. Because, Trump pardons and commutes and then pretty much pardons everybody. I think there may still be a couple of sufferers, but basically everybody, almost everybody, 99%. And then the story goes away. And yet the problem, besides restitution, I think these people need restitution. I think they should, be recognized as a group of patriots. I think that they really deserve a lot. However, absent that, they and the rest of us deserve an investigation into the perpetrators of this reign of terror, because it was a very Stalinist reign of terror that was designed. I was talking a lot about fear of speaking out. It was designed to suppress political liberty in this country. And it ruined lives of thousands of people, not just even the victims or the defendants, but their families, their businesses, their community. I mean, this is a huge group of Americans, solid American citizens, patriots, and there's no interest in in any venue, government, publishing, media. I mean, there may be one or two reporters who still even look at it. I don't even know what they're able to do anymore. I mean, it's like a lot. It's like the brick went down on the top of the can, and that's it. And that is so wrong.
Where can people find you, Diana?
Well, I'm at Real Diana West on Twitter, and I am on Substack, same. And I am, where else am I? Where else? Patreon. I'm on Patreon.
Any future projects you want to?
Well, I hope so, but not at the moment. Well, actually, it's not true. I just brought out a book of essays. You know, my website was canceled, sadly. I had a website for 15 years or something. And at the end of December 31st, 2023, boom, went away. And I did not resurrect it. I did not choose to resurrect it. It would have been difficult, probably possible in some way. But I did copy and paste pretty much everything. So I made a pass at the essays, the ones that I really labored over and tried to polish up as opposed to blog posts. And I released it. It's called Wake Up and Smell the Culture and Other Selected Essays. So that's brand new. And I am at work on a follow-on to American Betrayal, Controversy. So I am again kind of in the spirit of a collection. There was so much written about, not just by me, others, and so on. There was so much about the book as a controversy that was essentially logged at my website from different places and so on, that I decided I need to put that in a book form as well. So it's called Beyond the Betrayal, and that is my project at the moment.
Any idea when you'll get it out?
Well, I hope soon, but probably not until the fall.
Oh, that's not that far away.
Not that far away. Yeah.
Last question. What
I
do
have
you?
a beautiful cover. Yeah.
Oh, do you have it there? Can you show it or not?
I don't. I
Oh.
should get it. Yeah. No, my husband designed it. It's really nice. Next time I'm on, I'll show it to you.
Do you what do you think the United States will look like 10 years from now?
Well, I mean, you can imagine. I don't have any startling idea of that. I think I think our cities will be pretty unlivable. So I mean, I think they are to some extent, but it'll probably be worse. I don't have a good rosy view of the future at this moment. So
I don't either. We're kind of same.
yeah.
I was just curious. I thought maybe you'd make me feel better by your
Well,
10-year forecast.
yeah, Trump, I feel like with all of his flaws and frustrations and seemingly just kind of broken thoughts that seem good and then Trump is after Trump the deluge, I think. So I'm not going to, he certainly won't be, and I hope he's alive, but he certainly won't be in public life in 10 years. And I don't know what a one-man band can do at that, he is a one-man band. So that becomes an issue, what the post-Trump American first movement will be in 10 years is really hard to figure. But I feel like he is a bridge to an understanding or a sense or a feeling about America that, generationally we keep losing, which again, speaks to this concept of erasing culture, whether it's the left, whether it's been historically Islam as it grows. But erasing culture is about the worst thing you could do, to your world. It's so awful. It's just erasing and taking away identity. So he is, by age and by virtue of his, kind of magnificent persona, he is a kind of America that is not going to be ahead of us, I don't think. But we'll see.
Yeah, you definitely can see right now the changing of the guard and transitioning
Yeah.
from that generation to the next generation. And
Yeah.
it'll be interesting to see. Not that somebody talked to me about 28. I said I'm not even talking about any of that right now. Like, what is the point to discuss who may or may not be next?
Yeah.
But even the
Yeah.
midterms, I don't even want to talk about because it's like it's
No.
so far away. Like, what's the point?
Yeah. Well, yeah, they're important, but yeah, what's the point?
Well, it's just so early at this stage. I
Yeah.
mean, beginning of next year, yeah, I would talk about it a little bit more. But at this point, so many things. And I haven't been following the political side as long. But what I've learned is things can change. Tomorrow it could be a completely different landscape.
Yeah,
So why
that's
start
true.
exerting energy on something that's, you know, 17 months away?
Yeah, yeah. Well, it'll be interesting to see how the New York mayoral affects thinking, just because you've got communism and Islam, if people will talk about it, coming together to control New York City, most likely, and what that how that might focus people on the future could be actually positive. Not for New York City, however, but for the midterm, say, if you can really get discussion about communism and Islam in our society, that could be a good thing. But so far, the only rap on him is that he's a communist, and not his praise for Hamas fundraisers, things like that. That doesn't really come into the discussion, but it might. We might get it out there and see where that goes.
I know people in Connecticut, North Carolina, and Florida are really hoping he wins because you're going to see a mass exodus and a lot of money that's going to flow into those other states.
Oh, well, New York is very gone anyway, but yeah, it's it's pretty fascinating because in 2008, when Barack Obama was running for president, remember he was the post-partisan candidate and he was going to unite the country. And then when he started putting all these socialist proposals forward, you weren't allowed to call them socialist. And it was absolutely taboo. And I remember this very specifically because at the time I was a commentator on CNN doing the presidential cycle, and I was writing about it in my columns. But I remember having this feeling in the control booth. I was alone in DC remote to the New York show, and I remember sitting there and thinking, I'm going to say socialist tonight. I'm going to, I really had to kind of almost talk myself into it because there was this pressure not to mention the obvious that I was experiencing, even though it was unsaid. Isn't that amazing? So I did. I did get it out there in a fairly anodyne way, but I got called a red baiter by one of the other guests. I didn't really quite know what a red baiter was at that point, but it's very close. What it actually was a great key to American betrayal because I've realized that it was supposed to stop the conversation. And in the same way that Islamophobe is supposed to stop the conversation, it's the same kind of tool that you suppress debate. But it was so interesting to me because then you get 10 years later, you get to Ocasio-Cortez, et cetera. Bernie starts coming out as a socialist, not an independent, and things like that. All of a sudden, it's out there. But it was suppressed, I think, at a time when the left was afraid that America might reject it. But now we're at a point where it becomes the cover for Zoran Mandami. It's okay to call him a communist, just don't call him pro jihad. So everything, I guess that is at the Overton window moving or something like that. But it's another notch in the slippery slope, right? To where
And isn't he also though? Isn't he a pro-trans, LGBTQ, and all that too?
probably, yeah. How
So
can you not?
would that even be jihad? Is that like a hybrid jihad, pro-trans,
Well,
LGBT?
Queers for Palestine.
Yeah, that's
There's a group quiz. Well, this goes back to that 1960s phrase. It's how you get seemingly disparate, if not warring factions together on the same side. And this is something goes back to the 1960s protests, where you'd see all these different leftist factions who had nothing to do with each other marching together. And I actually wrote about this in The Death of the Grown-Up. And the point is, as somebody commented, the issue isn't the issue. It doesn't matter if it's Queers for Palestine or Hamas. The issue is the revolution. It's all about destroying the other side, the civilization, the Judeo-Christian, the Western. It doesn't matter what your passion is, but you all line up together, from trans to Hamas, which would defenestrate the trans or the homosexual. So, but here, for the moment, it's like a marriage of convenience.
Diana. I always enjoy our conversations. I look forward to the next one. I think next time, well, I don't know about next time, but at some point we got to do a movie one. Unless we just do a movie one
Absolutely.
before major world events happen, because I'm curious of like your background in film, and I didn't even know you were a movie critic. background of film, your love of film.
I
Can
would
I ask
love
you? Let me
to.
ask you one more question. Are you
Yeah.
going to go see any movies? Do you go to the theater anymore?
No, but I live kind of out in the boonies. So,
But would you go if there was one accessible?
um,
Is
I
there
mean, I
any
used to
movie,
like
where I'm
going
going
to,
with this, is there any movie that
yeah.
would grab you that you'd want to go see in the theater today?
Not at the moment. No, not at the moment. I mean, it's kind of the dinosaur in me at this point, but we'll talk. We'll put this out there
Yeah, I look
next
forward to
time.
that. I look forward to
Okay,
more
that sounds great,
conversations
Mike.
ahead. Thanks, Diana.
Thank you. Talk to you later.
Mic drop.